to a tenth of the original figure, to 15 million US, which means that a vast array of projects are going to be potentially eligible for inclusion under the NaRRa regime. And this means that the governance arrangements are absolutely critical going forward for the people of Jamaica and for investors and for our international partners to have confidence in this new construct called NaRRa. The governance arrangements, the transparency of its operations, the accountability of the persons who are reposed with responsibility for executing its functions, all of these are vital. And this is where the bill falls well and seriously short of what is required. The fact of the matter is that NaRRa is a statutory body without a statutory board. It is an aberration insofar as it is creating a legal entity with the powers that a legal entity have without the governance arrangements that are normal and necessary to ensure proper governance of the body itself. And I will speak to that in greater detail as I go through the bill. Madam Speaker, I propose to approach this today really as an almost clause-by-clause analysis, because I think that is the easiest way for me to get through the points that I want to raise. I notice in the definition clause, which is clause 2, the definition of public body excludes executive agencies, which means that the provisions in NaRRa that relate to approving entities and the powers that would apply under NaRRa in relation to approving entities will not apply to bodies such as NEPA or PICA, the National Land Agency, National Works Agency. I'm not sure why that decision was made, because those bodies, and there are many others, are significant, but that is the effect of the way in which approving entity has been defined and public body has been defined when you look at those two definitions in tandem. The list of things that an approving entity is responsible for, which is in the definition there, said it includes functions related to a number of things: physical planning, roads, highways, etc. I raise the question because the word including is used and before the list of functions is set out. I wanted to know whether this would include other things that are not in this list, such as permits and licenses that may be needed by the designated strategic investment projects, which are the private sector projects, such as licenses to operate a casino or gaming facility, hotel or resort licenses, wharfage licenses, sufferance wharf licenses to establish private ports, petroleum facilities or energy facilities, and so on. These things, I'm not sure whether or not it's intended that the definition of approving entity would extend to those types of regulated functions, because the language used in the definition says that the list that's provided there is not a exhaustive list. It is just a list of things that happen to be included. And I think that's very important and needs to be clarified. In the definition of goods in section 2, clause 2 of the bill, it speaks to goods means things of every kind and description, whether tangible or intangible. That's a very peculiar definition, Madam Speaker. Intangibles are the antithesis of goods. And to say that goods extends to intangibles is very peculiar, and I think that needs to be reconsidered. I note that in section 4, there are lots of references to projects. And again, because the bill isn't consistent in its language, it isn't clear to me whether the projects referred to in section 4, which are the projects that the authority is responsible for dealing with, are limited to approved reconstruction and resilience projects, which are so defined in section 17, or can NaRRa pursue other projects that are not on the cabinet's official list of projects? I think if there was a consistency in the language, it would be clear whether NaRRa is limited to these approved projects that are on the section 17 cabinet list, cabinet approved list, and the private sector projects which are designated under another provision, or whether other projects may also be pursued by NaRRa. I think that needs to be made clear. Madam Speaker, in the subsection 2 of clause 2, there is a provision that allows the minister by order to alter a definition of works. And that order is not subject to affirmative resolution. I think it is wrong that a minister can effectively alter a statute passed by Parliament through the House and the Senate without coming back to Parliament for approval of that amendment. And I think subsection 2 of clause 2 ought to be subject to affirmative resolution. Madam Speaker, when you look at clause 3 of the bill, which is the one that establishes it as a statutory body to which section 28 of the Interpretation Act applies, it's not an executive agency, it's a statutory body. It can sue and be sued in its own name, it can own property and so on. That's what the Interpretation Act allows. There are no objects or purposes stated in the law, in this bill, in relation to what NaRRa is about. And if you look at section 25, 1B, 2 of the Act, it says that the cabinet may designate a project as a strategic investment project if the project contributes to the achievement of the purposes of this Act. But there's nowhere in the Act which clearly sets out what the purposes of the Act are. And I think there should be. If you look in the memorandum on objects of objects and reasons, which was not strictly speaking part of the legislation, but is there to guide parliamentarians and others as to what is intended. There are set out in A, B, C, and D of the memorandum on objects and reasons some basic purposes for which this legislation is being passed. And I think that those ought to be incorporated without this specific references to a particular disaster, but those ought to be incorporated in the bill, perhaps in section 3, so that section 3 would not only just establish the authority, but would also set out the purposes and objects for which it is being established. I think that is a major omission from the bill. There's a reference in 3.2 to the schedule, which is, they say, shall have effect as the constitution and procedure of the authority. And when you look at it, that's quite a normal way of our legislation dealing with statutory bodies. The schedule was set out, basically what would be the equivalent of the articles of a company as to how it should function procedurally. But all that is addressed in the schedule to this bill relates to the CEO of the authority, nothing else. So it really doesn't, the schedule does not have effect as to the constitution and procedure of the authority. It really only governs the CEO. And that is extraordinary. There's no provision, as I've said, for any board of the authority, for any audit committee, for an internal auditor, for any risk management functions, anything of that nature. And this is an entity that is going to be responsible for administering and managing the expenditure of billions and billions of US dollars worth, if we're to understand, both from the public sector side, but also to facilitate private sector investors as well through speeded up, expedited procedures. This cannot be right. And when I spoke last week I said this bill ought to go to a joint select committee. And it should. Even if you require that joint select committee to complete its deliberations within a finite period of time, perhaps a month, because of the urgency of this, it needs to have the benefit of interventions and contributions from stakeholders, from the wider society that have a strong interest in this. Madam Speaker, I noticed in clause 4, which sets out functions of the authority, it doesn't make any reference to designated strategic investment projects. Now, that's strange because the authority does have a role to play in relation to designated strategic investment projects, which are the private sector projects. But in the functions of the authority set out in clause 4, there's no reference to them. And that is odd. And there are numerous references, as I said earlier, to the word projects, but there's no definition of the word projects in the bill. There are references later on to these approved reconstruction resilience projects, and there's references to designated strategic investment projects, but they're in clause 4, they're just references to projects, and you don't know what the scope of that is, and it's not clear what is intended. Madam Speaker, I know that there's no provision providing for any exemption for duties and GCT on materials imported by NaRRa for these projects. I don't normally, one would expect to see something of that nature in a body that's being established as a public body to undertake works of this nature. There's no provision for that. It isn't even clear to me whether NaRRa is intended to implement projects as such. In the previous version of the bill, the first version, it specifically stated that, where am I? It specifically stated that NaRRa would implement projects, but in the bill that's before us now, it isn't that clear. It talks about that they shall procure goods, works, and services for the implementation of projects, programs, and plans, but it doesn't specifically say that NaRRa is the implementation agency for these projects and on the public sector side. And I think that needs to be added. We also need provisions that speak to, in the functions, speak to prudence, efficiency, and transparency in expending public resources. That should be there. There should be reference to those things. Value for money in procurement, that should be mentioned. Risk management functions, that should be mentioned. Fairness in the procurement and hiring practices, that's a particular matter of concern to the opposition. We would like to see a principle embodied in the legislation of non-discrimination for political affiliation or other characteristics like religion, ethnicity, and so on. That is missing as well. There needs to be in this because of the level of resources that will be expended by this. Subsection 3 of Section 4 says that for the purpose of performing its functions under the Act, the authority may, subject to any regulations that may be made, do anything and enter into any transaction which, in the opinion of the authority, is necessary to ensure the performance of its functions. Anything. And that effectively means that the CEO can unilaterally decide the scope and boundaries of its activities, because the CEO is the only required employee. There will be other employees, but the CEO is the only person who has real authority under this legislation within the construct of NaRRa itself. And it says that he, or she, can do anything and enter into any transaction which, in the opinion of the authority, which means his or her opinion, is necessary to ensure the performance. Madam Speaker, I turn to clause 5, which deals with the appointment of the Chief Executive Officer. The law is not clear as to who the Chief Executive Officer reports to. There is a reporting section where the minister can require reports, but that's a different thing from a management perspective and a governance perspective. Who does the CEO report to? It's not clear. How is the CEO's deliverables decided? What are the key performance indicators applicable to the authority and to the CEO's functions? Nothing at all on this. It says that in section 10 that NaRRa reports to the Prime Minister, but there's nothing about the CEO's reporting responsibility. And that is a big issue. Madam Speaker, clause 6 of the bill says that the authority and the Chief Executive Officer, the CEO, can, with the minister's approval, delegate to any person the performance of such of their functions other than the power of delegation, as they may from time to time consider necessary. Now, this power of delegation is significant because any functions can be delegated. The question is, what transparency will arise in relation to delegated functions? You know, important functions could end up being delegated to third parties on terms which are not disclosed, as costs that we are not aware of. There should be a report on all delegated functions by the CEO, and that report should be sent to Parliament on a timely basis. Transparency demands that. Clause 7 talks about the minister's ability to appoint committees to examine and report to the minister on any matter arising out of or connected with the authority's powers and duties. But there is no provision in the bill in relation to this committee that the Prime Minister spoke to, called JAMROC, which he says is the equivalent of EPOC. Now, EPOC had no responsibilities for oversight of any operating entity that is expending zillions of dollars. That is what NaRRa is going to be doing. A large number. A large number. EPOC's responsibility was to get data from the Ministry of Finance and the Bank of Jamaica on Jamaica's economic performance and report to the public on how Jamaica was faring in complying with its commitments under the IMF agreement. So it was a reporting function based on data that was made available to it as to whether Jamaica was on track. This is a totally different function. There's no comparison. This is like a massive conglomerate being operated by a single officer, a CEO with no board and no proper oversight. It's wrong. This bill ought to establish a board along the lines that JAMROC is intended to follow, and that board should be the board to which the CEO reports. And there should be proper governance provisions in the schedule as to how that board operates and clear lines of oversight and accountability. JAMROC has no legal powers and is not a legal construct. It cannot effectively provide oversight or ensure accountability within NaRRa. It has no legal authority and it doesn't exist in law. And to suggest otherwise is very misleading to the public. I turn to clause 8 of the bill, and it deals with the funding of the authority. And it says the funds of the authority shall consist of such monies as may from time to time be placed at its disposition for the purpose of this act by Parliament. I assume, and I'd like it to be clarified, that what that is saying then is that NaRRa's resources from public resources would have to come through an appropriation act. It would have to be included in the budget of the country or in a supplementary budget. And I was wondering about the various disaster risk financing arrangements that the government has put in place. There are two statutory funds. There's a disaster fund and a national disaster fund. There are the the insurance arrangements with CRIF. There are the catastrophe bonds which have been entered into and so on. And I was wondering, what is the mechanism by which those resources would be made available to NaRRa? Is it intended to be automatic that they are the ones who expend those resources, or will it be on an ad hoc basis? I think it would be useful to have a clearer understanding of that. I turn to clause 10, and it says that the authority shall furnish the minister with such reports, returns, accounts, and other information as the minister may require. Now, supposing the minister doesn't require any reporting, or doesn't require any formal reporting, written reports, this cannot be the reporting obligation to put it on this discretionary basis. The CEO should be required to prepare semi-annual reports, which the minister should table in Parliament, and the CEO should be required by law to attend Parliament twice a year, like the Bank of Jamaica's governor is now, under the Bank of Jamaica Act, to answer questions in relation to those reports. That's what transparency demands. The clause 11, which deals with reporting, speaks to annual and other reports shall be prepared by the authority. And it says a copy of the annual reports and audited financial statements should be submitted within 4 months of the financial year to the minister, and then the minister shall, within a reasonable time. Why a reasonable time? Why not a specific time? Why not within 45 days or 30 days? Cause those to be tabled in Parliament. There should be, as I've said, semi-annual interim reports to update the nation on the progress through Parliament of the challenges being faced, how those challenges are being addressed. There's a complete absence of proper oversight for this body. Clause 12 speaks to the need to submit to the approval of the minister by the September 30th of each year a corporate plan, an operating plan, and its estimates of revenue and expenditure for the financial year. I assume it means the next financial year. I was wondering whether this is subject to the Ministry of Finance's role in finalizing budgets in the normal way that there's a budget call and the statutory bodies, ministries, etc., well, central government bodies submit their proposals for funding, and then the Ministry of Finance essentially scours all of that and the resources that are available and decides what is actually affordable. Is that process going to apply to NaRRa or not? It's not clear to me from the wording of clause 12 whether that will happen. I move to clause 13 of the bill, and it says the minister may give directions to the authority. We are accustomed to seeing laws which say that the minister can give directions as to general policy to a public body within the minister's portfolio. This is not like that. These are operating directions. The directions under subsection 1 shall be such as the minister appears desirable in the interest of effective performance by the authority of its functions, and to ensure, well, I'm not sure if it's and or because that's not stated, to ensure that approved reconstruction and resilience projects and designated strategic investment projects are implemented in accordance with the terms of Cabinet's approval and the public interest. So the minister has a direct, intrusive role in the operation of NaRRa. And, you know, there's nothing to require directions to be in writing, to be gazetted, so that the public is aware of them. Again, all of these directions that the minister is giving in this body, this critical body, there should be transparency around those directions. There should be a report on all semi-annually to Parliament on what directions have been given by the minister to this body, so that the public knows what is going on. Yeah, I need some more.
Time has expired. Next speaker. You don't get extension. You don't get extension. I don't know. We'll allow the leader of the opposition 10 minutes, and members, for the other members, you will have to operate within the designated. Also, the process of turning on your mics before your knowledge means you will have to turn them off so that we can allow the leader of opposition the additional time. And I'm not sure who would have been in the lineup. Opposition leader?
Yes, Madam Speaker.
Leader, hold on. Let me ask House Leader to just move the motion to allow the extra time.
Turn off.
Madam Speaker, we ask that the leader of the opposition be given an additional 10 minutes to complete his presentation.
Members, the question is that the leader of the opposition in the debate be allowed an additional 10 minutes. Opposition leader, 10 to 15 minutes at most. Those in favor, those against, the ayes have it.
Madam Speaker, I don't think we should be parsimonious in allocating time to the leader of the opposition in his presentation on this bill in particular.
Leader of opposition,
Anyway,
with all due respect, all of us are required to follow the rules, including you.
No, there's a discretion in these matters.
And you got a discretion.
Yeah. So,
10 minutes now, sir. 2 minutes. You can go to
Madam Speaker, it also says that directions under subsection 1 may require the authority to take or refrain from taking certain actions, or to refrain from adopting or pursuing a particular course of action. The minister is in a position to directly interfere in how this statutory body is performing its functions. It's the CEO is there, but the minister is the one who can really direct how it works. And that is not how we normally. And these directions are not required to be in any way disclosed. They're not even required to be in writing. But there should be proper transparency and disclosure around these directions by the minister. Madam Speaker, I was going to say some things in relation to clause 14, which deals with secrecy. I'm going to not use my time for that because I'm aware that one of my colleagues intends to speak on that issue. I moved, and also the provisions on indemnification. I would only say that the way this is worked, the wording of the clause 15 on indemnification is that if the CEO or any other employee is charged for a criminal offense, even if that person is convicted, they can be indemnified if it's deemed that they acted honestly and in good faith, and that taxpayers have to pay the legal fees of that convicted criminal. That is bizarre, to say the least. But it's bizarre, to say the least. Madam Speaker, clause 17 talks about approved projects. And it says that the authority shall develop programs and detailed plans, including project scope, delivery arrangements, and timelines. But why does that not make reference to budgets, project budgets, to funding arrangements, and to the contractors and professionals that are to be engaged in these projects? Why are those things not included in the programs and detailed plans? That doesn't make sense to me. And it isn't clear as well exactly what NaRRa's role is in relation to the designated strategic investment projects, which are not referenced here at all. One thing that I noticed is that clause 18 says that programs for reconstruction and resilience shall be developed by the authority, shall state the goods, works, and services necessary, and then it goes on to say, identify all relevant persons involved in and their respective roles in the delivery of the program. And that all has to be submitted to cabinet. And I'm just saying that this disclosure of all relevant persons, from our point of view, it sounds like It's a mechanism for ensuring that persons who are affiliated or perceived as not being on the side of the government can be weeded out of any of these projects. And, you know, to my mind, it is just a carte blanche for political victimization. And that is why it's important that the functions clause has those principles of non-victimization embodied in it. Clause 19 deals with plans, but it speaks to that the authority must update plans periodically, and after any material change in a plan, the authority shall review and update plans periodically, and after any material change of which the authority has noticed and that is likely to adversely affect or delay the implementation of the plan, that is dealt with there. But my question in relation to that is, material changes in these approved plans should be promptly reported to the minister and should be brought to the attention of the cabinet. Because if there's an adverse effect in a major project that is cost related, it is vital that that information be shared promptly and should not be within the bosom of the authority, when at the end of the day, it's going to become something that the public purse will have to address. So I think that there should be something that deals with these material changes and the need to report them on a prompt basis through the minister to the cabinet. Madam Speaker, since I have limited time and I have a lot more I'd like to say, but I'm not going to be permitted to do so, I just want to make a point here. There's a provision for directives, that the NaRRA can give directives to these approving entities, which are local authorities and other bodies that deal with project approvals. And these directives are under a regime here. There's no transparency in relation to directives that are given. The directives don't have to be gazetted according to this. There's no report to Parliament on the directives that have been given. So what you have is NaRRA effectively second-guessing the agencies of the state or the bodies that are normally responsible for the approval process, imposing their own views on what the approval should or shouldn't say. And there's no transparency around that. And that should be, to my mind, and I would like to see provisions that require these directives to be made public through the Parliament. There should be a reporting mechanism on them. And I think the absence of that is a dangerous thing to build into a law of this nature. And then, of course, there are the step-in arrangements, where if the authority issues a directive and the approving entity, the local authority or other regulatory body doesn't comply, then the minister can effectively step in under clause 24. And the minister may by order approve an application made subject to any terms and conditions, vary, modify, or remove a term, condition, or qualification to which an approval was made subject, and so on. Again, we need transparency with respect to step-in orders. They should be made public, they should be posted on the NaRRA website, they should be included in semi-annual reports to Parliament, because effectively what this is saying is that the minister can override what all the entities that the law has established to perform certain functions may have decided are the conditions of approval of a particular project, or the decision whether to approve or refuse. There ought to be transparency in the legislation in relation to these step-in requirements. This is a very extraordinary regime. It's an extraordinary regime. There's no existing regime like it. And so and therefore there ought to be proper transparency in relation to it. I move to part 4 of the bill. Madam Speaker, I only have a minute left. Part 4 has this provision where this bill is brought to an end. We don't know when the minister responsible for this legislation will decide that the date of dissolution should arise. But when that decision is made, the authority is automatically dissolved. And when the conception of this as something that relates only to Hurricane Melissa reconstruction, when that was clearly the purpose of this, I could understand why they would have that in there. But given that this has morphed now into a regime for facilitating the expedition of private sector projects, I'm not quite sure why we still have this automatic dissolution arrangement in it. It doesn't really seem to make sense to me. I'd like to hear why they consider that to be appropriate. And there also, I noticed where it says, on the day of dissolution, all monies which became payable to the authority shall be paid into the consolidated fund. But if you have pending or incomplete projects and all those resources now go into the consolidated fund, it could significantly delay the execution of those incomplete projects. I think there needs to be some thought put into that. And my last comments are in relation to in the schedule, Madam Speaker, there's no annual performance reviews provision for the CEO. There's no provision in terms of revocation of appointments. There's nothing to do with failure to achieve contracted deliverables or to satisfy key performance indicators. It is not the normal thing you would expect in a contract of employment with a senior executive. The provisions are more what you'd accustomed to see in relation to an officer who's holding a public office rather than somebody running an organization as a CEO. And I think that is a peculiar thing. And the last point, Madam Speaker, is just to say these provisions which allow the CEO to sign authorizations under the seal of the authority on his own and to sign contracts and other documents on his own with no oversight. Dangerous. This, from a governance perspective, this legislation is an aberration. It needs to be.
Leader of Opposition, your mic is off. Leader of Opposition, your mic is off. Don't give me the time. Now, members. No, it is not. I actually gave extra time, and it is in deference to the Leader of Opposition. Members, I'm asking you, please be reminded on the Speaker's ruling in respect of order of speaking and use of the mic. I gave the extra time. The member from St. Catherine North.